Welcome to Yachting International Radio. You're with Karine Rayson from the Crew Coach on your mental health. Okay, so we are recording. I have Richard with us. Welcome, Richard.
Hi, how's it going?
So this is a very proud moment for myself, and I'm sure for you too, and I think the industry at large, because you're actually the first male to join us to speak about mental health
Oh,
in the industry. So
cool.
yeah, thank you very, very much for being courageous to do so, because I think this is something that we need to do. And
Uh,
as crew, we need to speak more about it to break down the stereotypes and the stigma and unpack what it's like to have a mental health issue and what to do, what are your coping mechanisms, and who do you go to for support. Recently, I've had a lot of male crew members, particularly chefs, who have brought up the issue of alcohol and drugs. It's something that they're finding it really, really difficult to manage, could be a good word.
yeah.
And I would like to hear from your perspective, since you've spent many years in the industry and you've seen a lot of things. What role does alcohol and drugs play, and how can it take its toll on a crew member? Because I know it can happen quite quickly when things can spiral out of control.
Yeah. Yeah, I can talk to that for sure. So I think for me, back in the early days, in my early 20s, so I first started the industry nearly 20 years ago now, like 99, 2000. And in those days, early 20s, it was great. It was fun, it was parties, and it was all very, very positive. But like you say, I think as time goes on and maybe as crew get a bit more mature, I would say that's possibly whenever it becomes a problem. And I know for myself, it was whenever I reached kind of 30, 31, I was starting to question, my life decisions and where my life is going, that I suppose I started to realize that some of the time I was using alcohol as a bit of a release rather than just for a bit of fun, which is obviously quite positive. I mean, I'm not anti-alcohol by any means at all, but I think it's very important to be aware what you're using alcohol for,
Mm.
and whether it is just that fun or whether it is actually a release from your daily grind or whatever it is. And I think for me, then I made the decision, because I was in rotation, I made the decision in my sort of more senior positions when I was chief officer on a 90 meter. I took the decision just not to drink at all when I was on board. Um, but then, however, I did use alcohol a lot whenever I was off as well. So I think for me, then, as I said, I became sort of aware that I was drinking for the wrong reason. So I suppose that's the key thing, to be aware of why.
Mm.
Obviously going out for nights with the crew, that's all fun. If you're
Mm.
drinking in a galley on your own in the afternoon, that's possibly something to kind of be
Yeah.
aware of and think about.
And I was about to say, like, when do you think it starts to become a problem? And self awareness, not many people have self awareness. And when you suffer from addiction, you could be in denial. So there's different stages of addiction in
Yeah.
the cycle of addiction model. And one of them is denial. So, what are the warning signs? What would you say that are the key things you should note that may start occurring?
Well, I think, definitely number one, I think is it affecting your work in any way? Is it affecting you turning up for work? Number one, affecting you sleeping in, or is even if other crew are noticing maybe you're sleeping in or whatever that is, or is it just affecting the standard of your work? So I think one way to be self-aware is to just ask yourself, am I doing the best I can here?
Mm.
And then I suppose safety is a big thing as well. Is it compromising safety? And I suppose that's the biggest factor. Is it affecting your work? That's a really good, or are you, I suppose the next one is, are you being withdrawn?
Hmm.
I suppose I noticed that a little bit as well, was possibly becoming a bit withdrawn from the crew. If there was a crew activity or whatever planned, I remember in the later years of my career, I would have much preferred just to go for a pint on my own.
Mm.
And I would have used that excuse would have been, oh, I've worked so hard with all you guys, I live with all you guys, I can't wait to spend some time on my own, which is kind of a little bit true as well.
Mm.
But I think when you're doing anything on your own, I think that's really a time to really think about it. um
Yeah, it's when
and
you isolate. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
also when you start neglecting yourself, so self-care, just basic hygiene, you will find starts
Yeah.
deteriorating.
Yeah.
And also taking note of your behaviors. I've heard of one crew member who was drinking excessively and was urinating on deck.
Wow.
Mm.
That's not kind of
No.
normal.
So these are the sort of behaviors that are quite noticeable. I think it starts to get worse and worse and worse. So it's trying to pick up the early warning signs. And
Yeah.
the key one that you've just mentioned is, are you a social drinker or are you drinking to mask something that's going on for you?
Yeah. Yeah. And I
Mm.
think, for me, it was my work. I mean, I was told a good few times, that I was the most professional person on board and my performance was really, really good until I decided to start partying. And I suppose that's why I did make the decision to just not drink on board. It was an easy decision to make. I know that was easier because I was on rotation.
Mm.
Slightly less easy for someone who's on board, sort of 8 or 9 months a year, or even 10 months a year.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, I guess that's it really.
Mm.
Um, I think one of the things that I suppose people could do differently around that is it's along the lines, because for me it all ties in with mental health. There's no separation between whenever a behavior, it could be any behavior, becomes a problem and mental health. I mean, it's
Mm.
the reason that we're doing that is to escape from something.
Mm.
Um, so I think we mentioned about self-awareness there, but I think very often we know what's right and wrong.
Mm.
We know whenever our behaviors are slipping quite often.
Mm.
And I think the most important thing is to really be open about that, and with
Mm.
yourself, not necessarily with
Mm.
the rest of the crew, but I think times I've been under real pressure, and I've known I've been under real pressure, and I've been in denial. I'm like, but no, I have to be really macho about this. I have to keep going. I have to muscle on. And then it
Mm.
all ended in tears. To the point where my
Yeah.
body said no, and I didn't have a choice.
Yes.
So I
So
think,
that's something. I used to work in rehabs within jails. So a
uh-huh,
lot of my clients suffered from alcohol and drug addiction. And
uh-huh,
we were working in, I think the programs were running for 6 months. Yeah, I was doing treatment programs for 6 months. So it's psychoeducation and cognitive behavioral therapy. And
uh-huh,
what happened there? Yeah, they realized that they were suffering so much on an emotional level and they were using alcohol and drugs to cope. But working with these men in prison, they have no idea how to ask for help. So
yeah,
growing up, they've been abandoned, or they're street kids. And as adults, they had to learn to look after themselves. And the people that were supposed to be positive role models in their life were not available. So for them, asking for help is not part of their culture. But then
yeah,
again, in our community, for men to ask for help, as you just mentioned, there's that stigma and stereotype of you got to harden up, get on with it. Yeah, showing your emotions is weak or crying is weak. So,
yeah.
do you feel that that sort of stigma had an effect on your well-being or your ability to ask for help?
Yeah, well, I think possibly chefs are. I mean, I wasn't chef; I was chief officer, but chefs obviously very senior crew, and I know for a fact that they work some of the longest hours there is, and for a chef who's very proud of what they do, and they pride themselves on the produce they're producing, it's very difficult to try and manage the time in order to get more downtime. And I would say it's extremely difficult and I guess if we're talking, obviously, if we're talking specifically males, it's very difficult to go to a captain and say, look, I need to try and figure out a bit more downtime here because I'm really feeling the pace. Um, because chefing on shore, I guess, is notoriously busy as well. And I can imagine restaurants aren't like that, or at least they weren't anyway. I'm not sure if they are now, but you can picture that whole
Mm.
Gordon Ramsay type scenario where you just muscle on and you get on and you have to do it.
Mm.
So for me, honestly, I would say I never, yes, my own mind was what stopped me probably reaching out.
Mm.
That's the biggest thing. I remember one time coming into New York. We'd actually had a really amazing trip up north. We'd been to Greenland and Iceland and places, but it was non-stop. I mean, we were flat out, and it was cold, and it was challenging conditions. We'd experienced a lot of weather, and
Mm.
we came back down, and we were going into New York, and I was aware that I was not feeling the best. As I said, it was around that time I was 30, 31, and I was really starting to think, what am I doing here? Where am I going to go in life? And yeah, I did actually talk to one crew member, but I was actually told to kind of give myself a shake. I'd be okay, you know. So then I thought, I sort of questioned myself. You know what? Maybe I wasn't that self-aware at that time. I don't think I was, like you mentioned, and I started to question myself, and I thought, hang on a minute, just you're okay. There's nothing wrong here. But it turns out, well, cut a long story short, I was on a plane within a few days because I got very unwell
Mm.
from that particular time. And I think if I had been honest and spoken out about that more, then that could have been sorted out. Definitely could have been sorted out for
Mm.
sure.
So, given your experience, and I guess it's a combination of not asking for help earlier, but then also not knowing perhaps who to turn to for support, do you think that's
Yeah.
another thing? So, within the industry, what do you think we need to help crew in the mental health space?
Um, it's a good question. I think everybody in senior management needs to be more aware of it. Management companies, crew agents, and obviously the senior crew on board.
Mm.
Um, Definitely need to be more aware than ever. I mean, it would be lovely to get owners more aware of it in order to sort of coordinate the time, but there's always going to be that kind of thing that we're working on these big, lovely yachts, and you're
Mm.
having a great time.
Mm.
Um, it's quite hard to communicate that, how actually tough and how stressful and how much the hours do affect people.
Mm.
And I'm not sure. It's like everything now. I'm not sure if it's getting busier, or why is it that it's becoming more prevalent. um, I don't know if it's the bigger boats. Obviously chefs is a good example because the boats are far bigger than ever before, and the demands are probably bigger than ever before. I mean, people are much more discerning about what they're eating and that sort of thing, so there probably
Mm.
is more demands. The schedules, boats are going places they've never been before. The schedules are just greater. um, for senior crew, the boats are bigger. There's more people to manage. It's just, and the legislation is so much greater. So I guess this people need to realize just that the crew have a lot to do. I mean, I remember joking with a captain once, and I'm sure a lot of crew will identify with this, is writing a job description for a chief officer,
Mm.
and you're like, well, how many books have you got? There's just so much. Once you write it down on paper, you realize there's just so much that you do, and that sort of makes you realize how much stress you're under. And that obviously that's true for chief stewardesses, chefs, chief engineers, and really everybody on board.
Absolutely.
Um,
There needs to be a focus on the human element side of yachting. And I think it's crucial to do workshops every 6 months where you
yeah,
basically do a check in and
yeah,
see how the crew engagement and morale and well being is
yeah,
going, and
yeah,
just implement the necessary strategies if need be. And another thing is
yeah,
mental health first aid. So we're focusing on safety, physical safety on board, but psychological safety is just as important. So it's about putting those courses on for crew so that they are better aware and they can pick up the early warning signs, and then they just direct it to professionals.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. And I think, I guess maybe by default, sometimes in boats, there's kind of the trusted person that you would go to, that you feel, sometimes it's the chief stewardess, sometimes it's somebody else, sometimes it's, could be a chef as well, or anyone. But I think maybe to formalize that could be good. I mean, I know now, I don't know about schools where you are, but I know schools here, for example, not all, but some of them have full-time counselors in the schools
Mm.
where, children can go in a very confidential environment and talk about things.
Mm.
And quite often it's difficult to figure out, how does that actually, I mean, someone like you maybe would have more ideas. How would that actually look in the industry? Where would that person be?
Yeah, so I offer counseling. I'm a qualified
Yeah.
counselor in my undergrad in psychology. And then iSwan also offers counseling, and I believe they essentially started off as being commercial, and now they are working within the super yacht industry. So they have counselors available 24 hours a day,
Uh,
and they can speak different languages, whereas I can only speak English and I understand French. But going to land base and the resources available for employees, we have something called the Employment Assistance Program, where employees can
right.
contact a counselor, whether it's physically or over the telephone. Uh,
Uh,
the biggest thing that they find with that, though, is it's not well used purely. Well, if I speak from my personal experience and speaking to correctional officers and therapists working in the prisons, I don't feel comfortable connecting to someone on the outside when they have no idea what it's like working within
yeah,
a jail.
exactly. Hmm.
And I think it's the same with crew. It's like, how do
Yeah,
you really understand what I'm going through if
yeah,
you've never
yeah,
worked as crew? Like, it's
uh,
such a bespoke industry. And
yeah,
it's also about having that rapport. So, getting to understand the person who you're wanting to connect with, because it's all about rapport. Like, treatment is going to be, it's only going to be effective if you have a rapport with your counselor. So
yeah,
with big organizations and just calling a random counselor, I mean, it's great, like we do need it and it works for some people, but personally for me, i I turned away from it. And working in such a fast-paced industry, it's, if you don't allow the time
yeah,
to breathe or attend to your mental health, then it's going to seep out at some point.
yeah,
Having
yeah, definitely.
a
And
mental
I think what you said there is so key about somebody understanding the business, because I can give my sort of personal experience. I remember coming home again around that time, sort of early 30s, where's my life going, and sitting down with somebody, and they shook their heads. They were like, but hang on a minute, you work on a big shiny boat, your life's perfect, you
mm,
know? So they didn't understand because they hadn't experienced it. Because, let's face it, we do work in a very enviable industry, which I guess makes it more challenging, the stigma side of things, because
mm,
people outside the industry, they really think we're leading this perfect lifestyle, and they don't
mm,
get the stresses or the strains. And you know um, so that's key. That's such a key point, to have somebody like yourself who's experienced it to be offering
mm,
that support. I think is
mm,
fantastic. It's really, really good.
mm,
And even a lot of, maybe even a lot of management and a lot of agency, employees, some of them maybe do understand, maybe have been through it, but also some haven't as well. They haven't actually been on board. And I only realized that really when I lived in the south of France. There's kind of this divide between the shore based industry and the onboard industry, and it is quite a tangible divide. Um, so I think it's really important that the shore side of the industry, particularly management companies, really get on board with, you're going to need it from a human point of view. But if they want to think about profits or bottom lines, then they
mm.
can, because it does affect that as well. It
It
will
does.
crew turnover, and yeah,
Yeah, and apparently at the moment it's very, very high. There's a lot of incidences of burnout and crew turnover
yeah,
as a result, or taking sick leave. It is a cost thing, and also for the owners, like crew
yeah,
longevity. I mean, that's
yep,
why the crew are turning over so
hmm,
fast, because if you actually value the place that you work, because, and if you feel that you're respected and taken care of and you have
yeah.
the right support, why would you leave?
Yeah, exactly.
Most
And
crew
you
leave
and you can
because they're
stay.
not happy in the workplace. Yeah.
Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. And that's support. And I think I've said to you before, I find it difficult to kind of understand how, we've these extremely wealthy individuals who run very successful businesses. And by the nature of those businesses, I mean, my sister works in leadership for a corporate bank, and the support they offer their employees is unreal, in terms of workshops, in terms of personal development, in terms of that sort of thing. And obviously those sort of organizations are being run by the owners of the yachts that we're working on. So I find it kind of hard to understand how that hasn't permeated down into their personal life as well. And so how, like, who are the people to communicate with the owners and,
Mm,
let them know that when they have a 90 meter boat, it's like running a business.
it
It's, they
is.
need to,
Mm,
see it as the same way.
mm,
And that kind of the development, the support is needed as much as it's needed in their businesses on shore.
mm, mm, 100%. And that's what's
Yeah.
lacking is the human resources department on board, because, as you said, the chief officer, the captains, and chief stewards are knee deep in paperwork, that they
Yeah.
don't have time to manage the interpersonal relationships
Yeah.
occurring on board. And so, yeah, it's something that would benefit the yacht if they outsourced it.
Yeah. Definitely.
And
Definitely.
before we wrap up, the other thing I wanted to talk to you about is recently there's been quite a few deaths occurring on board, whether it's
Mm.
natural or suicide.
Mm-hmm.
From your experience in the industry, what would your advice be to crew who have witnessed a death or are or have surrounded by a death happening on board? What would you
Yeah.
recommend that they do to take care of themselves?
Um, yeah, well, like, without going into any detail, I can say that I have experienced a death on board. Obviously, for sensitivity reasons, I won't go into any details, but it does affect crew. It definitely does affect crew, 100%. And again, the upper management need to understand that even if we experience a death of someone that we don't even know, it still affects us. If we see a car accident and we witness someone dying, that we're humans. It will affect us no matter what, even if it's a boat next door and we've never met the crew member before. It definitely will affect us. So I think everybody needs to be aware of that. In terms of crew, I think from my point of view, it's always best, prevention's better than cure. It's best to have a chat about things straight up front and get things out in the open.
Mm,
If you just think, oh, I'm fine, and get on with it, again, that can manifest itself later on, like even months, even much longer down the line, because there could be that subconscious trauma that you're unaware of, unless you sort of sort it out up front. So I think it's something not to be scared of. Again, it's nature. I mean, there's nothing, if it's a tragedy, obviously it's really, really terrible. But let's face it, people die, but it needs to be talked about. There's no point brushing it under the carpet. I think, yeah, we got to just be open about it because it does affect people, definitely.
thank you, Richard.
That makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's great.
Cool.
Very.
And can I talk about the project that I'm doing at the minute? Is that possible?
Please do tell us. Yes.
Yeah, cool. So I think one of the things that I realized in yachting is, and I think one of the reasons why I got a bit my perspective got a bit jaded, because in the early days, I got into yachting because of a love of the sea. Number one, I love the sea. So recently, I've set up a podcast. It's called the Nautical Project, and I'm going to interview all sorts of people who have a real connection with the sea. So not just yachties, but divers, fishermen, seafarers, merchant seafarers, all sorts of different people, artists, all different backgrounds who have a connection with the sea. So I think my goal for that is, and I do see that having maybe a bit of a slant towards mental health as well, because obviously the sea, there's a big push now. I swim in the sea every week here in Ireland in the freezing cold, and it
Mm,
is so beneficial for all forms of health. So
mm,
I guess my podcast is to really inspire people to spend more time in, on, or around the ocean, because it does just make us feel better. And to keep that perspective, I think, is a really key thing for yacht crew as well. I know as chief officer, if I was really wrapped up in the daily grind, it is amazing how just a 30-minute walk on a beach, or
mm.
a swim around the boat at lunchtime, or whatever you can squeeze in, can just reset everything.
It's true.
And so I
Mm,
suppose that's what my podcast is. Kind of, it's it's just interesting stories for people who aren't involved too much to find out as well.
mm.
But I think the sea can be so beneficial if we remember. It's easy to forget.
It is.
um
It's very
so yeah.
healing. Yeah.
It's
And
extremely,
there's
yeah,
science behind it in terms of its grounding properties.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But I
How
think,
do people get hold of you if they wanted to connect?
yeah, so if anyone has any ideas for people to jump on the podcast or listen to it, it's simply the Nautical Project.
Mm,
And that's over Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Just simply that, the Nautical Project.
okay, fantastic.
And the podcast has been released now on Sunday, the 14th of April.
Oh,
But before, yeah, this Sunday. So just before we go, Karine, I just want to say, you're doing a great work. And I
wonderful.
think it's so important that we get your support out to more crew. Definitely.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thanks so much, Richard. And
Yeah.
all the best with your project. It's
Thank
exciting.
you very much.
And I feel like,
Thank you.
you know what's so nice? I feel like we're building such a positive and supportive network.
Yeah.
Just having this business, I've connected with so many amazing people that just want to give back and are
Uh-huh.
very purpose
Yeah.
driven.
Yeah.
And I I personally feel supported, even though I'm so far away. Well, it feels like I'm so far away, but the crew are just spread out all over the world. And it's just
Uh-huh.
amazing what social media can do and the power of it in terms of building relationships.
Yeah. There is positives. Just, I mean, a lot of people are negative social media, but there's definitely big positives for sure. And
Okay.
it's great. It's great. Fantastic.
Great. Thank you so much for your time. And I'll speak to you
No
soon.
worries. Chat soon.